Ladies and gentlemen, when you stop talking to a narcissist, it's tempting to assume they feel what most people would feel: sadness, regret, or heartbreak. But that assumption comes from a healthy emotional framework, and narcissism doesn't operate there. What's happening instead is something far more destabilizing: a narcissistic injury. This isn't about missing you as a person. It's about losing access to the psychological mirror you provided. Your attention, your reactions, your emotional engagement, even your pain helps stabilize their sense of self. When that disappears, it doesn't register as grief. It registers as threat. For a narcissistic personality, identity is externally regulated. They need constant feedback to confirm who they are, that they matter, that they have impact. When you go silent, that feedback loop collapses. There's no reflection coming back, no reassurance, no emotional response to organize their inner world. That void is profoundly uncomfortable, and it triggers anxiety, shame, and a sense of exposure they work tirelessly to avoid. Silence strips away the illusion of control and confronts them with something they cannot tolerate: insignificance. This is why silence often feels more provocative to a narcissist than confrontation. Anger still keeps them central in your emotional universe. Silence removes them from it entirely. And that absence destabilizes the carefully constructed self-image they rely on to function. Without you engaging, they are forced to face the fragility of their identity, and that's where defensiveness, distortion, and reactive behaviors begin to emerge. Philosophically, this moment exposes a crucial truth. The narcissist's suffering isn't rooted in love lost, but in self-structure threatened. They are not grieving a relationship, they are defending an identity. Understanding this reframes everything. It explains why apologies feel hollow, why remorse seems performative, and why accountability is so elusive. The pain you're witnessing isn't empathy, it's ego collapse. And this is where your power lies. Your silence isn't punishment or cruelty, it's clarity. It interrupts a dysfunctional system and removes you from a role you were never meant to play. When you stop talking, you stop propping up someone else's identity, and you finally begin reclaiming your own. Once the narcissistic injury sets in, the next move is rarely introspection. Instead, what follows is an urgent attempt to restore control, and this is where hoovering comes in. When you stop talking to a narcissist, your silence creates uncertainty, and uncertainty is intolerable for someone who relies on dominance and predictability to feel stable. Hoovering isn't about reconciliation or emotional repair, it's about reestablishing access to your attention, your emotions, and most importantly, your responsiveness. These attempts can be surprisingly subtle or theatrically dramatic. You might see sudden apologies that feel oddly detached, nostalgic messages designed to pull you back into shared memories, or declarations of vulnerability that appear just believable enough to make you hesitate. In other cases, the outreach is framed as urgency or crisis, illness, confusion, or claims of personal growth. But beneath the surface, the psychological motive is the same: to test whether the emotional cord is still intact. Even a brief response reassures them that they still matter, that they can still provoke a reaction, that the dynamic isn't truly over. What makes hoovering so confusing is that it can mimic genuine remorse, but real accountability involves tolerating discomfort, respecting boundaries, and allowing another person autonomy, all things narcissistic patterns struggle with. Hoovering collapses under those criteria. It ignores your stated need for space and reframes contact as something you owe them, subtly shifting responsibility back onto you. In that sense, it's less a request and more a bid for power disguised as connection. Philosophically, this moment reveals the difference between influence and intimacy. Influence seeks control. Intimacy allows choice. Hoovering is an attempt to reclaim influence without earning intimacy. And when it works, even briefly, it reinforces the narcissist's belief that relationships are tools rather than mutual exchanges. This is why your restraint matters. Each unanswered message isn't coldness, it's boundary maintenance. It teaches a new psychological reality: access is not guaranteed. And when you hold that line, you're not just disengaging from manipulation, you're stepping out of a cycle designed to keep you small. Silence here isn't avoidance, it's self-respect made visible. When silence doesn't pull you back in, the narcissistic system adapts. and one of its most reliable defenses is rewriting the story. If you are no longer available to validate their version of events, they construct a new narrative where your withdrawal is not a boundary, but a betrayal. In this revised script, you are suddenly unreasonable, ungrateful, unstable, or cruel. This isn't impulsive dishonesty, it's psychological survival. Accountability threatens the narcissistic self-concept, so reality must be reshaped to preserve it. From a clinical perspective, this is a form of externalized blame and cognitive distortion. Accepting responsibility would require tolerating shame, ambiguity, and emotional complexity. Experiences narcissistic patterns are organized to avoid. By recasting themselves as the victim and you as the aggressor, they maintain moral superiority and emotional safety. It also allows them to explain your absence without confronting the truth, that someone chose to disengage because the relationship was harmful. This narrative rewriting often extends beyond the private inner world and into social spaces. Friends, family, coworkers, even strangers may hear a carefully edited account where your silence becomes evidence of your defect, not their behavior. This serves two functions. First, it recruits external validation to stabilize their ego. Second, it pressures you indirectly to return and correct the misunderstanding. It's a sophisticated form of coercion, one that relies on your fear of being misrepresented. What's important to understand is that you cannot correct a story that was never meant to be accurate. Trying to defend yourself only pulls you back into the dynamic they're trying to preserve. The narrative isn't about truth, it's about control. And the more you engage with it, the more oxygen it receives. Philosophically, this moment highlights a painful but freeing reality. You don't get to manage how someone committed to distortion perceives you. Your integrity doesn't live in their version of events. It lives in your consistency, your boundaries, and your willingness to step away from a system that requires you to disappear for it to function. Let them tell the story they need to survive. Your silence writes a different one, a story where you choose clarity over chaos and self-respect over endless explanation. When attempts to pull you back fail and the rewritten story doesn't restore control, you often see a sharp emotional shift. The narcissist oscillates between rage and indifference, and this swing can feel disorienting if you don't understand what's driving it. One moment there's anger, accusations, even contempt. The next, there's a sudden coldness, as if you never mattered at all. This isn't emotional inconsistency in the ordinary sense. It's strategic self-regulation. Rage serves a purpose. It restores a sense of power when silence has taken it away. Anger is activating, organizing, and self-affirming. It allows the narcissist to feel dominant rather than exposed, superior rather than abandoned. By casting you as the enemy, they convert vulnerability into aggression, which feels safer than shame. That anger may be expressed directly, or it may leak out through sarcasm, passive aggression, or sudden cruelty. The message underneath is always the same. You don't get to disengage on your terms. Indifference, on the other hand, is used as punishment. It's a performance of emotional withdrawal meant to signal that you are replaceable, irrelevant, or easily erased. This apparent detachment isn't peace. It's a defense. If they can convince themselves and you that you never mattered, they don't have to confront the pain of losing control or the discomfort of introspection. Indifference becomes a way to deny dependency while still communicating dominance. What makes this oscillation particularly destabilizing is that it invites reaction. Rage provokes defensiveness. Indifference provokes doubt. Both are designed to pull you back into engagement, to make you question your resolve, your worth, or your interpretation of reality. But once you see the pattern, it loses its power. These emotional shifts are not reflections of your value. They are attempts to regulate an ego that cannot tolerate uncertainty or loss of control. Philosophically, this stage reveals something essential. When someone needs your reaction to feel real, your absence becomes their greatest threat. You don't need to counter the anger or decode the indifference. Your steadiness is the disruption. And here's the truth to sit with. You don't have to attend every emotional performance you're invited to. Choosing not to engage isn't weakness. It's the moment you stop letting someone else's instability dictate your peace. When your silence holds and the usual tactics stop working, the narcissistic system looks elsewhere. What often follows is a rapid search for replacement supply, another person, another audience, another source of admiration or attention that can temporarily numb the internal void. This can happen quickly and publicly. New relationships may appear overnight. Social media may suddenly feel performative, or there may be conspicuous displays of happiness meant to signal that you were easily replaced. But this isn't resilience, it's avoidance. At a psychological level, narcissistic personalities struggle with emotional self-soothing. They rely on external validation to regulate mood, self-worth, and identity. Your absence removes a key stabilizer, and rather than sit with discomfort, reflect, or grieve in a meaningful way, they distract themselves with novelty. New supply provides a short-term boost, admiration without history, attention without accountability. It offers relief from the anxiety and shame stirred up by your disengagement, but it never addresses the underlying wound. What's important to understand is that this pattern is not a sign of healing or growth. It's repetition. The cycle restarts because the core issue remains untouched. Without insight and sustained effort, the same dynamics that harmed you will eventually surface again with someone else. That's why replacement supply often looks intense and idealized at first. It has to be. The fantasy phase is doing a lot of psychological work. For the person who has stepped away, this stage can be particularly painful. It can trigger self-doubt, grief, and the illusion that you were the problem. But the speed of replacement doesn't measure your worth. It measures their discomfort with emptiness. A person who cannot be alone with themselves will always rush to fill silence with noise. Philosophically, this moment asks you to reconsider what real connection looks like. Depth requires presence, accountability, and the ability to tolerate discomfort. What you're seeing instead is consumption. People used as emotional regulators, not met as equals. So if you find yourself questioning your decision, remember this. You didn't lose something stable. You stepped out of a cycle that required your depletion to continue. Let them chase distraction. You're choosing something rarer and more enduring. The slow rebuilding of a self that doesn't need to be borrowed from someone else. And this is where everything quietly shifts. Not in a dramatic confrontation or a final conversation, but in the sustained absence of your voice. When you stop talking to a narcissist and truly hold that silence, you introduce the one variable they cannot manage. They can provoke emotion, rewrite narratives, recruit allies, or replace supply, but they cannot control disengagement. And that loss of control is profoundly unsettling. Silence removes the levers they once relied on. There's no argument to win, no reaction to exploit, no explanation to twist. Without access to your inner world, they are left guessing, and that uncertainty disrupts the entire dynamic. For someone whose sense of stability depends on predictability and dominance, not knowing where they stand is deeply dysregulating. Your quiet becomes a psychological boundary that doesn't require defense. What's often misunderstood is that this silence isn't passive. It's an active choice to step out of a system that thrived on emotional extraction. It denies fuel without escalating conflict. It refuses participation without inviting debate. And in doing so, it forces the narcissist to confront the one relationship they've been avoiding all along, the one with themselves. That confrontation is rarely embraced, which is why so many of the earlier behaviors intensify before they fade. From a philosophical standpoint, this moment is about agency. Control relies on engagement. Power shifts when you withdraw consent from the dynamic entirely. You stop playing the role assigned to you, the fixer, the explainer, the emotional anchor, and reclaim authorship over your own life. That's why silence feels threatening to them and liberating to you. This is also where healing begins, not because the other person changes, but because you do. The absence of constant emotional turbulence creates space for clarity, grief, and eventually, peace. You begin to hear your own thoughts again. You start making decisions based on alignment rather than reaction. So if you're wondering whether your silence matters, let this land. It does. Not because it punishes, but because it protects. Silence is the moment you stop negotiating your worth and start living from it. And that choice, quiet, steady, and resolute, is where your freedom takes root. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe, my friends.